I always start by drawing just a rough sketch. I try not to get bogged down in too much detail, but you have to draw it right. Um, you saw me draw the horizon line first, and now I'm just building some of the main shapes, the marquee of the building, the curbs. I'm showing you there where I cropped off my image from the photograph. So there would just be an interesting composition, maybe a funner design. Um, Now I'm drawing into the main figures. These figures are the ones that I have to get, fairly correct. They are going to be caught in shadows and reflections, but I want to make sure that the angles of the legs are correct, the height of the torso compared to the legs. Those things are all important. I don't draw a ton of feet simply because I usually tie it into a reflection or a shadow. So I give all of my students permission not to draw feet, but go ahead if you want to. Just trying to get the curvature of this figure's arm, hips, leg. I don't even draw a second leg there simply because um, one I don't want the figure to be static. I want them to be connected and walking toward the crosswalk. Um, I even drew in some of the reflections, just a simple line to remind me that they're there. There's the crosswalk, and you see I'm following the perspective of the painting, which is the building, the cars, all of the figures. Here I'm placing the crosswalk light or the traffic light. You'll see it in the photograph. It's placed differently, but I thought it might be a better spot for it there. You see me drawing the public lighting. Now I'm starting in on the distant figures, the heads, making sure that their heights are correct, making sure that they look natural in their setting, making sure that they're not placed equally apart. They overlap. They move. As I get further away from my focal point, you see that the figures just become literally just scribbles. Now I'm building up the second wall where the building goes down the street. That's the box office little marquee. In the corner is just going to be a dark shadow, so I don't have to pay too much attention to it. I just scribble it out. Same thing with the traffic light. Um, I know it's going to be dark, so I just scribble that out and remind myself that that's going to be dark. I move the cars around a little bit, one overlapping the other. You can see you don't necessarily need to erase that. I did simply to show you that you can, but it's going to be such a dark value that the pencil line would to erase it is unnecessary. Now I'm just checking distances between some of these larger shapes, finishing up on some of the figures, trying to get everything just to harmonize a little bit more. There's a little detail on the marquee that I don't want to pay too much attention to, but now I think it's ready for the first few washes. Just making sure that everything looks connected. Everything looks good. So now the first couple washes. Since this is a night scene, I want to knock down that crosswalk. So I add just a little grade wash in. Now I'm moving into where the reflection of that marquee will hit the street. You notice I'm painting through objects. That's where the cars will hit. That's reflecting that light on the building. Although that'll be much darker. I'm hoping for a nice undertone there. Little marquee. I don't want too much white around. I really the main light source is going to be that marquee, so I'm going to knock out as much of the white paper as possible. You see how I connected the cars, the sidewalk, even some of the figures, all while it's still wet. Big sidewalk, leave that a nice dry brush. Now I'm cutting into some of the distant figures, grabbing some of the public lighting as I go. This will all dry much lighter. In fact, I'll go over quite a bit of this. It's just to get in the first washes that I need to show a little bit of range and sparkle with the light. You'll see I'm laying in some heads there of just figures randomly, quickly. Don't get bogged down on that stuff. Now I'm going to move into the crosswalk and the marquee on that left side. I don't want your eye focused on that top left corner, so I'll do that fairly roughly. Now the big wash in the foreground, or the street rather, bouncing in and out of figures again, starting to create legs on some of them. This foreground, it needs to be much darker, so I'm getting in some color that'll peek through. But as you'll see, when that dries, it'll dry much lighter. So I'll need to reinforce the values on that. There goes the connection between the figures and one of the car windshields. Here comes the big shadow, which will have to go much darker. I'm throwing in a little purple into my burnt sienna so that it goes from a cool to a warm. There I'm connecting more of the vehicles right into the wash. That'll be the separating wall, or where the wall, the building turns and goes back down the alley. See how much that dark wash just kind of dissolved in the foreground. I relieve a little tension on things like that where I think that it's too much of an interesting shape. I'll just use a little bit of water and pull out some of that tension to soften the line. I've moved this thing now for the third time. That was the traffic light, and I just felt like it cut the painting in half, so I moved it just to the left, closer to the main figures. This marquee again, it's really elaborate, but I don't want to paint it that way. I want it to be loose, I want it to be fun. I don't want your eyes up there. So I'm just mixing in a wash of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, softening some edges. Even though the marquee is my main light source, I want to knock some of it down with that gray, just so it's not a large rectangular clean piece of paper. It's too much tension. Now I start grabbing in some of the figures, connecting them, bouncing around some of the public lighting, grabbing a reflection while he's still wet. This is the reflection from the back of the building. It's going to spill out into the street. What I'm painting over now is just one of my figures, splashing a little bit of that light on the street that will be in between those figures. And if you notice, I've painted right through the figures in the foreground. That's because they're going to be much darker. So don't worry about painting through them. In fact, I encourage you to do that simply because then they won't feel cut and paste. They'll feel connected. Some of this is just brushwork behind the figures that indicates doors and windows. A little bit more of that. Some of the hard edge, which is a nice dry brush stroke on that marquee, that's going to help focus the eye. I've got to get this much darker. Just again a wash of burnt sienna, and then I'll hit it with the purple up in the corner, grabbing some of those figures, some of the cars. Same thing, I'm relieving a little tension on those shadow shapes right through their legs and then down through the street. I'm spraying simply because the wash that I'm laying in, I want it to be a soft line. I don't want it to be a really hard line. The cars are fairly dry paint. They get a nice hard brush stroke, hard edge, but the foreground needs to be soft. Laying this in just so it connects and doesn't drag the eye to that far right hand corner. See how just by laying in that dark shape, and there's several colors there, it pushes your eye away from that corner. I'm laying in reflections of not only the cars and the building, but some of the shirts, some of the figures that'll be that are standing there in the midground. I'm pulling out a little bit of paint there, simply to show a reflection of the marquee, some of the headlights on the cars. Although I'm not convinced about this car, I might turn him around and show his brake lights. Because it's such a straight line, I like to grab some figures so that it's more of an um, interesting line, and it relieves some of that tension. See how just a few figures grabbing the top of that makes it just less interesting, if you will. It has less visual tension. Now I'm doing some dry brush work, a window, underneath the box office marquee. Um, Grabbing some details that don't need to be painted, they just need to be a quick brush stroke. Letting it dry there for a second. Now I go to work on some of the figures. I started with the legs, the faces and the heads already done. Some of them have got their backs to us. Some of them, they're under the light, so you have to paint them correctly, just so that it feels like there's layers of people rather than just a row of people. You still see my foreground figures. You see how I'm painting through them. I'm not really worrying about them because I know they will be one of the darkest elements of the painting. Grabbing some reflections as I go, connecting the reflections to the legs and the wet washes of those figures, just so you don't have a hard edge there. Having fun with some of the figures. Try not to make them so stiff and just standing all in the same position. Some of them are walking in and out of the building or just down the street. This figure's just crossed the crosswalk, so they get a little bit longer reflection, and the legs will indicate that they're walking up onto that curb. A few more figures here. Figures are fun. I draw a lot of figures, and I'm always doodling with figures, trying to catch people in different stances where they're shifting their weight. I have sketchbooks full of figures. Now I'm just dropping a shadow side onto the faces of these figures. It's not a bright sunny day, but there's still light coming from the building, so they will have a shadow side to their faces. This guy I needed to pop him out a little bit more. He was kind of getting lost in that light area. These figures are literally just quick, brush strokes, indicate a leg or two. If you convince me of one or two figures, then I'll believe the others. There's maybe my main guy right there, which convinces me that the group behind him are figures waiting in line. There's a good connection to my vehicle from my figures. I'm pulling out just a little bit of paint while that wash is still wet to indicate a soft reflection. The foreground car gets a little different treatment. Maybe it's just got a different reflection, but maybe more interesting, like to flood that the window reflection rather, down into the hood and then the grill. Back to some of these figures and to pop, this guy is maybe an employee ticket taker. I'm going to push him out with a little bit of dark wash behind him. Some of the reflections of the doors, windows, so on. That pops him out a little bit more. More legs, arms, connect that group of three. As I'm going through this, I'm just thinking of, does this area look connected to this area? Is this pulling too much attention away from my focal point? Are the figures looking natural? Are they looking connected? Am I, a little dry brush work can make the viewer's eye go to a certain area and indicate all of that detail without painting it. All my two main figures that are about, I don't know, 6 inches tall. They're gonna pull and push the painting as I approach them. This is really thick paint now. This is a little water, and you can see I just pulled out some more water. You can see the dry brush on the paper. These guys are going to be silhouetted. There is color. I'm mixing a combination of ultramarine blue, a maroon, maybe a purple, to get them really dark. And I'm meaning to get them as dark as possible. So I leave some of them dry brush. I'm going to hit him just because he's got a little side of his face. There's his jacket, which is a burnt sienna. Again, I paint right through what I've already painted, or I paint over what I've already painted through these figures so that they don't look connected, or so that they don't look cut out, rather. I'm connecting that, or both those figures there, because if I didn't, then that might look odd. That might create an unwanted tension. You have his head, his legs, darkening his face a little bit. Remember, these guys are backlit. Grabbing a reflection. I don't like to mirror my figures when I paint reflection, simply because it's not natural. I don't think that it's totally believable, so I'll make it up. So you have fun with your reflections and your shadows. I feel like this just needs to go darker, this foreground curb that they're on. So I'm gonna blow through their reflections and darken it, and then I can get to them later. Burnt sienna to warm it, a little purple in the very foreground to cool down. That's my traffic light that I've been playing with the whole painting. The reflection of it goes right through that reflection of that figure. I'm pulling up some paint here to maybe bring in a light reflection in a dark area. Headlights, I'll pull out some of that paint to indicate the reflection. So think about when you're painting the reflection, what is it responding to up above it? Just darkening these crosswalks because I thought they disappeared a little too much. Spraying that foreground again so I can get a little texture in it. I don't use salt or alcohol. I like to use water when I'm painting in watercolor. I think it does the same thing as salt. It's just I'm painting with water, so I'll stick with painting with water. some more structure on that back building underneath that light. It doesn't have to be super detailed because it's being broken up with light. There's the traffic light and pole itself. Don't worry about whether or not it goes from top to bottom. It's not going to affect it. Lose it within a crowd. The curb was really the main line in this, where it immediately tells the viewer that those are reflections, and that simple dry brush line changes the whole thing. I'm putting in a few directional lines, just graphic lines, going down the street to my perspective line, vanishing point. Now I'm sprinkling or splattering a little bit of paint just to dirty up the street. This is Seattle, and the streets aren't manicured, and it's just a natural look. When I paint signs on marquees or signage or wherever, cafes, I'm always conscious of not making it legible, simply because if I was to draw, or if I was to write a legible font up there, your eye would just go right there. Now, if my objective is that, then yes, I'll do it, but I rarely do that. I like that scribble so that the eye sees it and then moves down to where I wanted the viewer to look. Now I'm just kind of splashing some cad red paint just here and around, just to grab. That's a scarf on her, a shirt on that figure. Maybe some of it splashing down into the foreground. Again, connecting it. I've moved on to the highlight of the painting, where I'm mixing just a little Chinese white with yellow ochre, and I'm just hitting the tops of their heads, the figure's arms, in any side of the figure that's facing the light. That was a little too white, so I added a little bit more yellow to that. The headlights of the car. I'm still debating on whether I'm going to turn that car around and make the car on the far right traveling in the opposite direction. A few more graphic details. We're really close to being finished. And there it is. I did turn the car. I added a few more figures in the foreground, but I think it was successful, and I'm glad you guys showed up to watch. Thanks again, and I hope to see you soon.